The invisible function of women in relationships is not a modern phenomenon, but rather a psychological wound deeply rooted in the cultural, familial, and emotional conditioning that Freud explored in the heart of his theories. From a very young age, the woman is shaped by the unconscious expectations that orbit around her: to be loving, to be gentle, to understand everyone, to forgive always. According to Freud, much of our behavior stems from the unconscious, and for women, that unconscious has been heavily colonized by the symbolic expectation of being the emotional caregiver of others. She is taught, even without words, that her value lies in her ability to hold others, to contain emotional chaos, to offer support without expecting reciprocity. And thus, she grows up believing that to be loved, she must make herself invisible. This invisibility is not just metaphorical. It takes shape in daily routines, in conversations interrupted, in unspoken pain, in silences when she wanted to scream. Freud would call this repression, the force that removes certain desires and emotions from consciousness to maintain the cohesion of the psyche. But repression has a price. It turns into symptoms, into anxiety, into fatigue, into an inner emptiness that no external love can fill. The woman who plays this invisible role begins to disappear from herself. She forgets what she likes, what she wants, what she dreams of. Her identity merges with the role imposed upon her, and in this fusion, she is no longer a subject. She becomes a function. The function of being the mother of the partner, the emotional nurse of the family, the tireless mediator of everyone's conflicts. Freud also spoke of identification as one of the mechanisms of the ego, and the woman, in her effort to survive emotionally, identifies with the needs of others to the point of forgetting her own. She internalizes the voice of the other as her own. She believes she is selfish if she rests, cruel if she says no, cold if she sets boundaries. But what she is doing is responding to an unconscious program that tells her, if you stop taking care of them, they will stop loving you. This fear is ancestral. It is passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter. It is the fear of abandonment, of rejection, of not being enough. Freud would say that behind every defense, there is a fear. And the defense of many women is to become what others need, even if that means ceasing to be themselves. As she becomes this emotional caretaker, her suffering is normalized. Society romanticizes her sacrifice, calls her warrior, strong, angel. But it is a poisoned compliment. Because while applauding her ability to endure, no one stops to ask what price she is paying for this endurance. Freud taught us that the unconscious is not silent. It speaks through the body, through dreams, through symptoms. And many women today are speaking through exhaustion, migraines, insomnia, low self-esteem, anxiety. They are screaming in silence because they were never allowed to say, "I can't take it anymore." The invisible function of women is not just a personal problem, it is a collective wound. It is sustained by a culture that fears women who say, "I don't want this anymore," because such a woman becomes unpredictable, uncontrollable. She no longer fits the mold. She no longer exists to serve, but to live. And this shakes the foundations of the unconscious masculine, which Freud explored as being insecure before female autonomy. For Freud, the fear of castration was symbolic of the fear of losing power. And what more frightening form of loss of power for the traditional male psyche than a woman who no longer needs him to survive emotionally? Thus begins the conflict. As the woman awakens, the system trembles. She begins to realize that her worth is not tied to the affection she gives, but to the truth she holds within. And then, little by little, she stops apologizing for being tired, stops feeling guilty for wanting time alone, stops smiling when she wants to cry. In this process, she regains access to her repressed self. And in Freud's terms, this is a process of sublimation, transforming the pain of invisibility into awareness, into action, into change. The woman who frees herself from this invisible function does not become less loving. She becomes more authentic. And authenticity is the first step towards real freedom. The woman who begins to awaken from this invisible function does not do so without pain. The process of becoming visible, of reoccupying her own identity after years or even decades of self-erasure, feels at first like an existential earthquake. Freud would recognize in this moment what he called the return of the repressed. That which had been buried deep in the unconscious, her desires, her anger, her fatigue, begins to erupt in dreams, in spontaneous tears, in a rage she can no longer disguise. And society, unprepared for this eruption, calls her unstable, calls her hysterical. Ironically, Freud's early work was precisely with so-called hysterical women. Women whose bodies spoke what their voices were forbidden to say. Their paralysis, their fainting spells, their inexplicable symptoms were not madness. They were protests. And the modern woman continues that lineage. Her symptoms have changed, but the message remains. I cannot carry this anymore. This awakening often brings guilt, which Freud saw as one of the strongest psychic inhibitors. Guilt arises when the superego, shaped by cultural and familial values, condemns the individual for deviating from the role it prescribes. A woman who decides to set boundaries, who refuses to be everyone's therapist, who stops sacrificing her time and energy to fix others, will inevitably feel this psychic pressure. You're being selfish, says the voice of the superego. But this is not her voice. It is the voice of every past generation that taught her that her only worth came from her utility. Freud would argue that in such moments, the woman is not just confronting her personal trauma, but collective, intergenerational trauma. And yet, some women persist. They begin to create a new self not based on compliance, but on truth. They start to explore what they actually enjoy, not what they were told they should enjoy. They begin to listen to their bodies, to the subtle signals of fatigue, desire, hunger, rest. This is not indulgence. This is the reclamation of self. Freud emphasized the importance of listening to the unconscious. And in this stage, the woman is finally doing that, not through a therapist necessarily, but through self-reflection, writing, solitude, creativity. Every time she says no, she builds a new muscle. Every time she chooses herself over duty, she creates a new pathway in her psyche. The neural pattern of self-erasure begins to weaken, and the pattern of self-respect begins to take shape. This internal revolution, however, has external consequences. Relationships change, friends disappear, family becomes distant, partners feel threatened, because when a woman changes the way she shows up in the emotional economy of a relationship, the entire system is disrupted. Freud described this as the economy of libidinal energy, a complex network of investments and returns. The woman who always gave now no longer does. The emotional ATM is closed, and those who had grown comfortable with her self-sacrifice respond with shock, resistance, even aggression. You've changed, they say. And yes, she has. She is no longer available for emotional exploitation. But the woman who persists through this stage begins to find something else. Peace. Not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of not lying to herself anymore. The peace of sleeping without pretending. The peace of being alone without feeling inadequate. Freud would recognize this as the formation of a more integrated ego, the self that no longer needs to split into a false persona to be loved. The woman is no longer driven by the need to please. She is driven by the need to live truthfully. In this new phase, new connections begin to emerge. People who value reciprocity, relationships built on mutual support, conversations where she can also be heard. It's unfamiliar territory at first. After all, she spent a lifetime being the listener, the container, the comforter. Now, she is the one being asked, "How are you, really?" And perhaps for the first time in her life, she allows herself to answer with honesty, "I'm tired. I'm healing. I'm learning to love myself again." These are not declarations of weakness. They are declarations of rebirth. Freud spoke of the death drive, the compulsion to repeat painful patterns, to return to familiar suffering. But he also spoke of eros, the life drive, the force of creativity, growth, and connection. The woman who escapes her invisible role is no longer ruled by repetition. She becomes a vessel of eros. She creates new rituals, new boundaries, new narratives. She reclaims her voice not just to speak, but to build. She realizes that love does not require her erasure, that care does not demand martyrdom, and that being needed is not the same as being loved. As the woman continues to reframe her existence outside of the invisible role she once embodied, she begins to encounter the deeper layers of her own unconscious. A landscape Freud insisted held the true motivations behind all human behavior. This is the stage where grief emerges. Not grief for someone who has died, but for the version of herself she never got to be. She grieves the youth she spent trying to be easy to love, the time wasted adapting herself to shrinking rooms, the silence she internalized to maintain false peace. And Freud would remind us that grief is not pathology. It is a necessary mourning of what was lost. This mourning, when honored, becomes the gateway to psychic reintegration. The woman is no longer fighting her past. She is digesting it. She is making peace with the younger self who didn't know any better. She is beginning truly to forgive herself for surviving in the only way she knew how, by disappearing. It's also at this juncture that many women encounter what Freud referred to as ambivalence, the simultaneous presence of love and resentment, of desire and fear, particularly in close relationships. She might still love the partner who unknowingly benefited from her invisibility. She might feel guilt for resenting the children she sacrificed herself for. She might feel conflicted about the family that praised her generosity but never asked about her exhaustion. This ambivalence is not a failure of character. It's a sign of emotional maturity. The ability to hold contradictory emotions without collapsing into shame is a profound step toward healing. Freud believed the psyche's health was not in perfection, but in the capacity to navigate conflict consciously. The woman now sees clearly. She was never weak for feeling tired, never selfish for wanting space, never cruel for saying, "I need more." This level of awareness begins to produce behavioral shifts that ripple through every facet of her life. She no longer accepts one-sided emotional labor as love. She no longer equates chaos with passion. She becomes more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Freud argued that repetition compulsion often traps us in familiar suffering until the unconscious is made conscious. And now, conscious of her patterns, the woman no longer finds it thrilling to be needed in order to be loved. She starts to desire partners who come whole, who can self-regulate, who do not see her as an emotional project. The magnetic pull toward the wounded, the chaotic, the emotionally unavailable begins to fade. In its place grows a new, subtler longing, to be with someone who adds peace, not turbulence, to her life. However, with this transformation comes solitude, at least for a time. Freud called this process of withdrawing libido from unfulfilling external objects a narcissistic turn, but not in the pejorative sense the word now implies. Rather, it is a period of deep inner investment, a turning inward to rebuild what was neglected. She begins to date herself. She takes herself seriously. She honors her time, her body, her energy. She no longer apologizes for needing rest, or silence, or space. She becomes protective of her own inner world, not as a fortress, but as a sanctuary. Freud would call this a form of sublimation, where instinctual energy is redirected toward higher, self-affirming goals. Her libido, once spent trying to maintain broken systems, is now used to write, create, move, dance, rest, breathe. Society, of course, does not applaud this phase. A woman in solitude is still seen with suspicion. She is called cold, difficult, or worse, unlovable. But now she sees through it. She understands that these labels are not truths, but projections of a system uncomfortable with feminine autonomy. Freud taught that many societal norms are defense mechanisms writ large, ways to suppress collective anxieties. And few anxieties are greater than that of a woman who no longer performs to be loved. She becomes a mirror, and many around her cannot bear the reflection. This is where the woman's power crystallizes, not in dominance, but in self-possession. She no longer begs to be seen. She sees herself. She no longer seeks permission to exist. She takes up space. She no longer explains her boundaries. She enforces them. Freud might say she has integrated the id, desire, the ego, reality, and the superego, conscience, into a more coherent whole. She is not perfect, but she is whole. She is not always happy, but she is real. And above all, she is visible, to herself, first and foremost. Now that the woman sees herself clearly, the world begins to respond in two opposite directions, one of admiration and the other of rejection. Freud believed that when an individual breaks away from neurotic patterns that society has normalized, that person becomes a threat to collective comfort. The self-possessed woman, no longer emotionally available on demand, no longer willing to be the silent therapist of others, triggers unrest. Friends may drift away, partners may lash out, family may criticize her transformation. But this too is part of the individuation Freud spoke of, a painful yet essential detachment from the old order to form a new psychic reality. She is no longer living through the borrowed lens of others' needs. She is no longer fueled by the unconscious command to be good, be kind, be nice. She has updated her internal script to something much more powerful. Be true. Be real. Be free. This freedom does not come without echoes of the past. There are moments when she still feels the pull to overextend, to make others comfortable at her own expense. Freud called this the return of the repressed, those old familiar programs resurfacing when least expected. But now she recognizes them. She breathes through them. She doesn't shame herself for the relapse. She studies it. Each time she chooses differently, the new neural pathways strengthen. Her unconscious is no longer a trap. It becomes her guide. Dreams become clearer. Her body speaks more softly. Her intuition returns like a trusted friend who had been locked out for years. And in this process, she no longer feels like she is betraying others by choosing herself. She realizes she is honoring the self that has been whispering beneath the surface all along. The idea of love also transforms. It is no longer about merging or completing or sacrificing. It becomes about sharing, two whole beings choosing connection, not dependency. Freud believed that mature love is rare, precisely because it requires two individuals who can stand alone before standing together. And now, she is one of them. Her love is no longer a transaction, no longer a desperate hope to be saved, no longer an emotional job description disguised as romance. She is capable of tenderness, yes, but not at the cost of self-erasure. Her yes means something because she has reclaimed the right to say no. Her presence is valuable because it is no longer automatic. She becomes a living refutation to Freud's famous question, "What does a woman want?" For decades, this question was interpreted as a statement of female mystery, of some unknowable essence. But perhaps the answer is not mystery, it is clarity. What a woman wants, above all, is to no longer be reduced to a function, to no longer live as an emotional tool in someone else's story, to be allowed the full expression of her psyche, desire, rage, joy, intellect, intuition, and all. Freud might never have found a definitive answer to that question, but today's woman answers it with her life. She wants freedom, not from love, but from the roles that have mutilated love into labor. This conclusion is not the end of her story. It's the beginning of a new era. She is not invulnerable. She still feels pain. She still gets tired. But now, she allows herself to rest. She surrounds herself with those who see her, not just need her. She builds boundaries not as walls, but as invitations. If you want to enter my world, come whole, come honest, come willing to meet me where I am. Her healing becomes contagious. Her daughters, nieces, and friends see her and feel permission to do the same. She becomes a reference point, not a savior, but a signal. That it's possible, that it's allowed, that no woman needs to disappear to be loved. And this is the revolution. Not loud, not televised, but deeply, psychically real. The woman who reclaims herself tears apart centuries of programming in a single breath of honesty. And Freud, were he alive today, might say, this is not neurosis, it is evolution. A woman who chooses herself is not selfish. She is sacred, she is sane, and above all, she is finally visible.